As many of you know that I've been working on the Track Ukraine project for some time as the Track Ukraine founder. We've been going through every single of the 450 elected House members. We're going through the senators, and we're also engaging with a bunch of campaigns that have both reached out to us and campaigns that we're interested in their position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so we've reached out to them. We've introduced a lot of them through the ambassador program, having Ukrainians who have been displaced, having Ukrainians who are both draft dodging, having Ukrainians who are in service, having Ukrainians in the labor movement, having Ukrainians from the press, having Ukrainians from all different aspects of civil society directly communicate with those who are making votes that could determine their future as well as Americans' own future. And so, I've been doing that work pretty thoroughly. I've been concentrating on it. I've been dedicating myself to it quite a lot. And for the last 3 weeks, we've been focusing on the Support Ukraine Act. For those of you who don't know, if you were not following, there was a piece of legislation before the United States Congress that would give Ukraine about a little bit over $1 billion worth of aid, which is nothing compared to the over $60 billion packages that were being passed during the previous administration. $1 billion, about 1.4 in total, plus another $8 billion that would be through basically like a lend-lease authority. So the vast majority of this aid package was not necessarily even, hey, here is aid that we're just giving you. Most of it, the vast majority of it was a loan. But it was for defensive articles and to support the Ukrainians, as well as to put pressure on the Russians so the Russians would see this signal and say, hey, now that Ukraine aid is passed during this admin, the next administration, maybe we'll get a worse deal. Hey, maybe even after the midterms, we'll get a worse deal. It's something that could compel them to negotiate. And even if it didn't do it immediately, this package plus another package in a year, that could really spell the end to the Russian narrative of, well, we'll just outweight the West and then we'll win the war. Well, if you can't do that, what do you tell the Russian public? When does the war end? And why aren't you negotiating? This is how you compel the Russians to the negotiating table. At the very least, that's one reason why I think it is a good legislation. So this legislation goes before a House vote. We're trying to grade as many people as possible before that vote, so we can say, hey, you're graded green because you've voted well on this. We hope you vote well on this act. And we go through some of the people we talked about. Like Kevin Kelly, we graded him 20 hours before he was the last necessary discharge petition signature that forced us to a vote. We, of course, graded Michael Lawler before he voted in favor of this. We graded other Republicans green before this happened. And we also graded some politicians green who then voted against this. And so now we're going to have to go through the process of, like Schweikart, for example. And so we're going to have to go through David Schweikart, that is. We're going to have to go through the process. Arizona's first, if I remember correctly. We're going to have to go through the process of looking at everybody we graded green and readjusting them to either yellow or readjusting them to red, as well as going through the rest of the people we hadn't graded yet and candidates on the campaign trail. When we said we track politicians' view on Ukraine, there's a lot of politicians that can have a vote on whether or not Ukraine gets support or not. So we got to go through the rest of the House majority. We got to go through the opposition. We still got to go through all these new candidates who want to get graded because, a lot of people are retiring. A lot of incumbents are going to lose. There are people who, even if they're not going to beat the incumbent, you should still know their beliefs. And so you can decide whether you should vote for the challenger or the incumbent. And so we're trying to get all that work done. And so I thought in the aftermath of this vote, my job would just essentially be having to go through, list all the Republicans that we graded green, and having to switch them over to yellow because they voted against what I think is a really important piece of legislation when it comes to propelling the Russians to end a war, when it comes to getting Ukraine what it needs, when it comes to moving negotiations forward, when it comes to undermining the Russian war machine, when it comes to continuing to build consequences for Russia's decision to invade and deterring a future invasion, when it comes to, fulfilling the promises and delivering on American credibility. There's so many different layers. The long-term issue of nuclear non-proliferation and Ukraine's success being, directly affecting that. I mean, there's so many layers as to why I think it's a good idea. And I thought I was mostly going to have to be focusing on the Republicans. And That is true. The vast majority of those who voted against this, the about 194 votes against this legislation, almost every single one was Republican. Almost. There was one Democrat that voted against this that also has gotten, I think, deserved heat, and it's the most heat I've seen Ilhan Omar get, who is the representative, in a long time. From Democrats, from Republicans, from people who are parts of her base, from people who are in the Democratic coalition, but maybe not necessarily within her base. She has gotten it from every angle, right? And what's interesting about Ilhan's position, where you read Republican positions as to why they voted against this, and some of them might be shiftable because of the conditions of the vote. Like, for example, this vote advanced by discharge petition. I don't want to disrespect the Speaker of the House when the Speaker of the House is fundraising for my campaign, and so I'm going to vote against this legislation. You know, stuff like that. Or I don't want to disrupt Trump's peace negotiations. Now, the former is much easier to deal with than the latter. If you have a House majority and a Senate majority, the Democrats get that. They put legislation up. There's no discharge petition. It's going to be voted on in the normal process, so that issue goes away. The issue about Donald Trump and negotiating, that's a little bit more difficult because a year from now, Trump could still be engaged in the same failed negotiations as he is now. So on the Republican side, you had people who, if they're movable on the fact that it was a discharge petition, and they're movable on the idea of Trumpian negotiations. Whether a year from now, Trump will have completely given up on negotiations, even though recently we heard a statement from Marco Rubio that seemed like they were low-key for giving up negotiations, or, you know, this discharge petition issue. So you get around that. Maybe you talk about how, hey, this has failed for over 2.5 years now, so we'd like your vote. Maybe you can move those Republicans. Maybe you can't, right? Hopefully you can. Maybe you can't. Ilhan Omar voted against it off of principle. Not because, I don't want to disrespect the House Speaker and get heat from them. Trump continues to say that he's working on this from a diplomatic angle, and so I'm going to vote against it, even though it's going to pass, and it did pass. Not veto-proof, but it did pass. I'm going to vote against it because I don't want to disrupt the president's peacemaking or set the president against me, right? And you can see the calculated strategy behind either of these decisions if you completely remove any political ideology from it. I don't want to piss off the president. I don't want to piss off the House Speaker. It could be, I disagree with the decorum of the discharge petition. I don't think that's really it, right? I think that the latter part of not wanting to piss off Donald Trump and Mike Johnson, probably more it. When it comes to Ilhan Omar, that's not it at all. It's because she opposes sanctions on principle. Sometimes. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's read what Ilhan had to say. I have always and will continue to stand with the Ukrainian people and unequivocally, sorry, English language is difficult, condemn Putin's illegal and brutal invasion. Says she stands with Ukrainians against the invasion. I voted against the Ukraine Support Act because of its inclusion of broad economic sanctions. Time and time again, sanctions like these fail to achieve their stated goals while inflicting real suffering on ordinary people. Opposing Russian aggression does not require us to support policies that punish ordinary civilians who did not ask for this war. The foreign policy establishment continues to return to the same failed playbook and expects different results. Economic sanctions fail to achieve their desired goals and in most cases are counterproductive to ending war. I remain committed to supporting diplomacy, peace, and justice for Ukrainian people affected by this horrific conflict, but I could not in good conscience support legislation that wages economic warfare on innocent civilians. Okay. So there's a few things I want to say. The first thing is the Russians are fine. Okay, they are not starving. They are not, their buildings are not collapsing in on themselves. I mean, their pipes are bursting, you know, they have structural issues. The economy's not in the best place. Inflation's not great. The Russian people are not starving to death. our sanctions are not making it so that the Russians don't have access to certain medicines on the international market. We are not strangling the Russians to the point economically where there are civilian deaths as of the result of our like a direct civilian casualties, where you could say there used to be food, we cut off food, they no longer have food. They used to be able to fuel these hospitals, now they cannot. People are dying in the hospitals, right? You could talk about in Yemen, there were hospitals that needed fuel to survive, and a Saudi fuel blockade that was strangling that fuel necessary for those hospitals to continue to support life, right? That is something where America dictating one organization, a terrorist group or not, cutting off NGO activity, supporting or not supporting a Saudi blockade, you know, these could have real, immediate, detrimental, like demonstrably harmful humanitarian impacts. When we talk about the broad-based sanctions we're talking about here, the Russians are not going to starve because of the sanctions. Food might get slightly more expensive because the transport nodes will get more expensive, but war is expensive. It is not our fault if the Russians decide that they want to engage in an extremely costly war that gets rid of their savings, makes their food more expensive, makes their fuel more expensive, and makes the cost of living higher. It is not the job of the United States to look out for the cost of living of people who largely supported an illegal invasion of another country that they promised not only that they wouldn't invade, but they assured that they wouldn't invade with us after we convinced the Ukrainians to disarm themselves. For this to be the concern of Ilhan in this moment, at this time, mind you, this is first and maybe the only large-scale, sizable, whatever word you want to use. It is the first, 1 second, I think there's like a smudge on my camera. The smudge of passion, there it is, gone now. This is the first major aid package that there has been a vote on in the House of Representatives this Congress. It is the first opportunity for them to send a message to the Russians, for them to send support to the Ukrainians, and for them to undermine the economics of occupation and the war machine. And she chose to vote against it because she doesn't want to wage economic warfare on civilians, and it doesn't work. Those seem to be the two things. Economic warfare on civilians, and it doesn't work. Number one, the Russians asked for this war. Okay, this is not a question of, you know, Putin did a military coup and then immediately invaded their neighbors, and all the Russians in every city tried to stop it, but they, you know, the foreign mercenaries or their secret police subdued so much of it. There were some anti-war protests, not enough. The majority of Russians at the outset of this war supported it. They supported it. And so why is it our job as Americans, where our government is supposed to represent the interests of the United States, why is it our job to look out for the economic health and well-being of the occupation and of those who perpetuate the occupation and of those who started it and started the invasion, wanted the invasion, and supported the invasion? Why is that our job? Especially if such caretaking of the Russian economy allows them to perpetuate the war. Because of Donald Trump's sanction, if sanction exemptions, time exempt, time not exempt, it's not time exempt if you continue to extend them. I'm just going to throw that out there. But that gives the Russians an inflow of hundreds of millions of dollars every month. They have gotten billions of dollars more money towards the war effort because of these sanctions exemptions from Donald Trump. Now, when somebody says sanctions don't work to end wars, if the question was, do sanctions work to overthrow a government? Well, maybe not, because trying to bring about different humanitarian conditions by worsening the economic situation might actually just worsen the humanitarian conditions and not change the geopolitical situation. And depending upon how the sanctions are done, you can actually ramp up local national sentiment against you. Yeah, but this is not sanctions to make the Russians choose a liberal or more, humanitarian leader. These are sanctions meant to undermine the Russian war machine. We are not talking about sanctions as i.e. to compel the Iranians to get rid of an atomic weapon. We're not talking about sanctions to make a country more pro-LGBT. We are not talking about a sanctions to make a country be democratic. We are talking about sanctions meaning to undermine the economy as the end in and of itself, because to undermine the sectors of the economy which fund the war effort, which is the energy sector, means that they will have less money to bomb Ukraine, less Ukrainians will be bombed, less Ukrainians will have their villages occupied, less bombs will be fired because less bombs will be made, less soldiers will get military contracts. And so one can pontificate about, well, you know, I do not like economic warfare on civilians. What is warfare but economic warfare? How many businesses have I seen blown out? How many restaurants have I seen burned to the ground? How many banks? How many auto dealerships? How many, you know, different carpentry stores, window manufacturers, coal mines and coal miners? How many different like little cafes and corner stores? American businesses have been blown up, destroyed, or damaged. Hundreds of American businesses. Economic warfare is warfare. Not only is war an extension of politics, as Clausewitz said, but economics is a part of warfare. Economics is what perpetuates warfare, and the economic foundation of a nation is often a target of warfare. What have the Russians targeted in their warfare campaign? They have targeted the electrical grid. They have targeted factories. They have targeted sometimes even shopping malls. They have targeted the basic necessities to life, which sustains the Ukrainian economy, which sustains the Ukrainian war effort. Is that economic warfare? Is it economic warfare to bomb a electrical plant? Is it economic warfare to bomb a substation? What type of warfare is that? Do we just call that regular warfare because that included an explosion? And so Ilhan Omar is willing to send military aid to defend villages. So she's willing to send artillery shells that blow up things. She's willing to do that. That type of warfare is fine. But economic warfare, the undermining of the economics of occupation, that is too far. That is a bridge across a river that we just cannot go across that bridge. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. Not only is it not our job to look after the economic well-being of Russians who largely supported the war and largely are either apathetic towards the war or allow the war through their apathy to continue, but it is also definitely not our job to support economic structures that are counterance to our other policy goals. To send Ukraine aid, but to also continue to prop up the Russian economy is to do two things that grind against each other. These are two things that policy-wise end goal, looking towards an end goal of ending the war, stopping Russian occupation, getting the Russians out of Ukraine, anything even close to that. If you allow the Russians to make money off of your economy to then fund the war, that you then have to fund packages to fight, then you're spending money on the Ukrainian side and then helping the Russians spend the money on the Russian side. So, I mean, if we're trying to end the war, we need to think about war through an economic lens. We need to think about how do we stop these drone factories from making more drones? How do we stop artillery factories from making more artillery? How do we stop the Russians from making more missiles? How do we stop the Russians from continuing to finance new military contracts? How do we grind the Russian economy to a halt? And that will require sanctions. If the goal of the sanction packages put forward against the Russians is to undermine the Russian war machine, then that has already been achieved. Not that we have done enough, not that the war has been ended, but every single sanction passed has undermined the Russian war machine to some degree by denying it capital, denying it money, denying it fuel to perpetuate itself. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about denying fuel to occupation, denying fuel to warmongering, denying fuel to imperialism, denying fuel to mass displacement of people, denying fuel to destruction of people's homes, denying fuel to the targeting of civilian infrastructure, denying fuel to the targeting of civilians themselves. Those human safari hunters and Hersons had to be hired on a military contract. Where did they get the money for that military contract? I'll tell you where. Rosneft and Gazprom, which also have their own military outfits that have been engaged in military activity. In fact, Gazprom, one of the companies involved in these sanctions, they would be one of the outfits that actually have their own military company, their own private military company, PMC, fighting in Ukraine right now. So not only are they indirectly supporting the war effort through monetary contributions, they are directly supporting the war effort through private military companies going out, killing Ukrainians, occupying Ukrainian territory, fighting the war. But we can't sanction them because we don't want to wage economic warfare. But the other end of this economic warfare, they're engaged in actual warfare. I understand people being sanction avoidant because you've seen sanctions applied and the humanitarian situation worsen. You've seen sanctions applied and democracy does not flourish. You've seen sanctions applied and the diplomatic end goal is not resulted. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. But in this case, you can get a diplomatic end goal through sanctions here. That might happen. You could maybe even in the long term improve the humanitarian situation. But the main goal before any of those secondary, and I will say that secondary objectives, is to stop the war, is to stop the Russians from continuing to perpetuate the war, rejecting every unilateral ceasefire. And how do you do that? By both meeting them with a wall of resistance, which the Ukrainians are doing, and we should supplement, but also by sanctioning the inflow of capital. $250 million. That's how much more the Russians are able to make and put towards the war effort every month right now as we speak, because Trump keeps extending these sanctions. Is it economic warfare against the Russians to not extend those sanctions further? And if it is that economic warfare so bad that it's worth allowing the Russians to use the money that we would then allow to flow in to engage in actual warfare that directly kills men, women, and children? This is a question that Ilhan Omar and her team have to ask. It's one thing to be anti-sanction for the purpose of trying to improve the humanitarian situation within Russia. That's not what these sanctions are about. The Russians chose the situation. They did. There was a moment at the start of the war where they could have chose differently, and they chose not to. They chose to support it before they fully realized the deep, deep mud that they had dragged themselves into. The main goal of the United States should be supporting the country that we made commitments to. That's Ukraine. The goal of the United States should be trying to bring the war to an end, and that means economically as well. And the goal of the United States should be not trying to look out for the economic health of the occupier. So I think that this position from Ilhan Omar really is not too defensible. I don't think it makes sense, and I think that it's wrong. And I really think that given the weight of this vote, her voting against it so she could signal like this on sanctions sends the wrong message. I mean, we could have had a united, every single Democrat votes in favor of Ukraine aid. It is a Republican issue. It is the Republicans who don't stand with you. And Ilhan could be like, well, I would support aid. I just won't support the measures that are necessary to make it so that the aid that we're sending isn't immediately countered by more munitions. Again, the goal should not be to grind down Ukraine while we float above the conflict economically until eventually the Russians tire themselves out. It should be making the decisions necessary to make the Russians come to the realization that there's no step forward and they have to either take an escape hatch or be forced through a trap door.